more older than you. Grew up with
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Michael Washburn, and I'm the interim director of public programs here at the Graduate Center. As most, recognize a lot of faces. As most of you probably know, the Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences and a center for applied and theoretical research, a platform for performances, conversations, and public debate. And as a community of scholars and students committed to the idea that learning is a public good, we regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, and distinguished artists addressing some of today's most pressing, intriguing issues and questions. And tonight we're discussing cultural preservation, and particularly the necessity of if there is a necessity, to preserve what are sometimes and often considered outmoded technologies, 78s and vinyl records, etc. And we want to also talk to some extent about how those technologies either enhance or diminish our enjoyment of the culture. And this is actually the perfect panel for that conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Michael Fremer. Michael's the editor of Analog Planet, which is an indispensable stop for audiophiles of all stripes. His reviews of music and audio equipment have appeared in Stereophile, where he's a senior contributing writer, and The Absolute Sound, Listener, and other publications. And he's widely credited with abetting the revival of vinyl as a superior technology for both musical fidelity and pleasure. And I learned two other things about him tonight. One, he was the supervisor of the soundtrack for the Tron movie, and he also starred as one of the voices in a feature animated film called Anima Olympics, along with Gilda Radner and Billy Crystal and Harry Shearer, which is, I think those are the two next events that we should do. Next up, we've got Amanda Petrusich. She's the author of this year's Do Not Sell at Any Price, The Wild Obsessive Hunt for the World's Rarest 78 RPM Records, which is published by Scribner. And her other books include It Still Moves, Lost Songs, Lost Highways, and the Search for the Next American Music, and Pink Moon, which was an edition in the 33 1/3 series of books about classic records. She writes about music and culture for a number of publications. She's a contributing editor at the Oxford American, and she also writes for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Spin, Pitchfork, and a number of other publications. And last weekend, this past Sunday, she had a tremendous piece in the New York Times Magazine about rural Greek music. It's worth checking out. Sam Stephenson was the Lehman Brady Visiting Joint Professor of Documentary and American Studies at Duke University and at UNC Chapel Hill. And he's a partner in Rockfish Stew Institute of Literature and Materials. It's a Durham-based documentary company. And his books include Dream Street, W. Gene Smith's Pittsburgh Project, and the incredible The Jazz Loft Project, the photographs and tapes of W. Gene Smith. It's part of a decade-long project which won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and the Innovative Use of Archives Award from the Archivist Roundtable of Metropolitan New York. And he's conducted over 500 oral history interviews and is now writing a biography of Eugene Smith entitled Eugene Smith Sink. And then Nathan Salsburg is archivist, producer, and a Grammy-nominated writer based in Louisville, Kentucky. And since 2000, he's worked for the Alan Lomax Archive, for which he currently serves in the capacity of curator, compiling and producing album releases of the renowned folklorist's recordings and managing the archive's online audio, photo, and video catalogs, including its YouTube channel. Nathan's produced archival releases for the Grammy-winning Tompkins Square and Dusted Digital labels, and he curates the Twos and Fuse recording imprint of Chicago's Drag City. And also, he's a tremendous musician. Later on tonight, you should go to YouTube and watch the man play guitar. It's extraordinary. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the Graduate Center's own Gary Giddins. Gary's the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography here at the Graduate Center. He wrote the Weatherbird jazz column in The Voice for about 30 years, and he's written dozens of books, including a jazz textbook used in universities across the country, Bing Crosby, A Pocket Full of Dreams, which is the first of a 2-volume biography, Celebrating Bird, The Triumph of Charlie Parker, which is now in its second edition, and Satchmo, The Genius of Louis Armstrong. Gary's work has been widely celebrated. He's won a National Book Critics Circle Award, the Jazz Journalists Association Lifetime Achievement Award, a Guggenheim, a Peabody, and it goes on and on. I could continue going on and on. That's about it for me. I've got one bit of housekeeping. A little bit later, we're going to open the floor for questions. So if you choose to ask a question, please use one of the microphones at either end of the room. Thanks a lot. Please welcome our panel.
Are we on? Are the mics on?
Testing.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Michael. We have a lot to talk about because it's a fascinating subject, and by the turnout I can see how fascinating it is. And I thought I'd begin by reading a passage. I was so flattered when I opened this book and found this description of myself by Amanda. about record collectors. Actually, it's not me, I'm not mentioned by name, but clearly it applies to most of us sitting here. So it's a good way to begin because, as Michael Fremer recently said to me, people who collect art, there's a certain status involved with that, wine, first editions, but record collectors are generally regarded as insane. And so Amanda writes, there is a stereotype in place, and it is unflattering. Picture, as we do, a middle-aged, balding, socially awkward, slightly plump or disconcertingly skinny, basement-dwelling dude who breathes through his mouth and wears stained shorts. Obviously, this is not always true, or even predominantly true. Most collectors have challenging full-time jobs, sustained romantic partners, pleasant social lives, and functional wardrobes. Provided you ask the right questions and don't try to touch anything, they can be charming, funny, and even sweet. So I'll begin with Michael here. How is this description fits like a, yeah.
Well, I just want to start by saying in today's New York Times, there is an obituary for a Chevrolet collector. He collects old Chevrolets. Okay, so that's okay, but I've never seen a record collector obit. I've seen book collectors, wine collectors, all these other collectability things, but we don't get respect, and I'm not exactly sure why, because most of us can dress well if we need to. I mean, I don't dress this way all the time at home. I've been all over the world talking to record collectors, and they're interesting, smart people. They all have real jobs, unlike me, who just does this for a living. And there's no reason why this stereotype exists, but it does exist. And the same exists for people who like good sound. These people are vilified in the press. You know, it's like audiophile, pedophile. I'm not sure which is worse. And it's this. You know, if you're a connoisseur of good sound, it should be a nice thing and a thing that you should be proud of.
In fairness to Amanda, one of the people who really created this characterization is R. Crumb. And I realize this is much too small for you to see, but it's a characteristic Crumb drawing of two record collectors who look exactly like that characterization. One of the things Amanda talks about, you used the phrase, the ecstasy of acquisition. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of us, it's been sort of an amazing thing to see a generation that isn't interested in the ownership, even of books now. I know people are giving away their libraries because they have one little toy that contains them. Mm-hmm. You're the closest we have to that generation. So explain, if you will.
Sure. Well, I mean, as you were saying, certainly that stereotype is present, and I hope that my book challenges it, at least in part. But it is changing. I think the way that we think about media, the way that we think about the acquisition of sound or of art is certainly changing. Although I feel like in my experience, and I teach writing at NYU, some of my students are here tonight, actually, which is very cool. And I've seen in them a sort of shift towards maybe craving the object a little bit more, craving the tactile experience, craving that experience of having a library about which you can say, like, well, look, this is part of me. This is a reflection of me to some degree. This represents what I want to represent. This is aspirational for me. I do think we're seeing that change a little bit. I mean, there's certainly been a commercial resurgence in vinyl, interest in vinyl records in the last few years that maybe indicates as much. But yeah, absolutely, times change. I think the fetishization of music as an object is perhaps a thing that is behind us. And I guess the thing we're talking about here tonight is whether that's good or bad, right? I mean, right. What that will yield.
I have a question. Is there a difference between acquiring the object to listen to it versus just to have it? I mean, did you find a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was actually a thing people have asked me a lot since the book has been published. And I'm very happy to report that nearly all of the collectors that are featured at least in my book, were really forthcoming with their records. They listened to those records. I mean, they collect 78, some of which are worth tens of thousands of dollars, but I never once encountered a collector who said, I'm not gonna play that for you, that's worth too much money, I don't wanna risk the degradation to the surface of the record. For the most part, they were really, and there were times when I believed them a little bit less, But for the most part, they all insisted that they were kind of in it for the performances. It was a way of owning and feeling closer to music that meant quite a lot to them emotionally.
That's one of the great things. You can collect it and look at it, and you can play it. You can't do that with stamps or some other things you can collect. And it's a great thing to just pull out a record, and you know where you bought it, you know what you were doing when you bought it, you know the people you were talking to, you know what was happening in the world. It's a wonderful thing, and I think a lot of young people are getting that now because the songs are so fragmented on a file, they have no connection to it. They have no connection to the artist. So when an artist comes out with a record and they can buy a record and have 6 songs on one side, 6 on the other, and a cover, it gives them a sense of connection.
Right, and it's an important way of contextualizing the work, which is certainly the job of a critic, and I think maybe to a lesser extent, but also the job of the listener, right? I mean, and Nathan is one of the collectors featured in my book, and I feel like you would speak really eloquently about the ways in which the things you have learned about some of the music that you listen to or that you love have kind of informed your listening experience. And in fact, I dare say you convinced me that that was really worth doing, kind of placing records in their proper social or cultural contexts, which owning it can do and learning about it can do.
I think it's important to, I think it's important to say that many people who are, by definition, collectors, in that we have thousands of recordings, don't collect them the way people collect stamps to fill out the catalog numbers. Especially in jazz and blues, you bought those records because there was no other way to hear them. They were not available on the radio. People would say to me, why do you have to have every record by Duke Ellington? And I would say, well, for the same reason I want to read every novel by William Faulkner. The only way you could do that in those days, you couldn't go online and find bad audio versions. You had to basically accumulate them, and then by definition, suddenly you were a curator of walls filled with records. I want to ask Nathan, as an archivist working with the Alan Lomax collection, it's often said that Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home, which I think is 1965, was the first album cover ever to depict other album covers. So the idea of fetishizing the album itself, the cover, and whatever meaning it brings to you, is a fairly recent one, I think. I mean, certainly people weren't sentimental about their 78s when LPs came in. They basically just trashed them. Sure. So talk about the question of archiving and the way it works in with the fetishizing of the product itself.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I would argue that the Dylan record wasn't the first to depict album covers, but maybe earlier sort of private pressings of white hot jazz in particular. There was a series of that International Association of Record Collectors that did the IARJC series for years, somewhere out in the provinces, and they would do this, pretty much awful white jazz.
That was a vanity.
Fair enough. You think that Bob Dylan's record wasn't a vanity project?
No,
no, fair enough.
Bob Dylan's Columbia Records.
Fair enough. I see the difference. But I guess there is something about that we gathered together these things that identify us. Dylan was doing just that with that record, saying, here are the things that influenced my work, this record in particular. And any of this sort of work, I think, curatorially speaking, is a way, and I think I say this to Amanda in her book, and I've said it a lot, but it's a way, like T.S. Eliot says, I shore these things against my ruins in the wasteland. It's a way of shoring ourselves up in the midst of sort of an uncaring, unfeeling universe. These are things that speak to us, and especially with regard to what iTunes doesn't do and YouTube doesn't do. YouTube does it to an extent, but it gives us the illusion of an unmediated experience with this primary source documentation in a way that we have the connection to the record that we found in that basement. It belongs to us, and maybe no one else knows about it. And there's the sense that I have with those IARJC records or whatever. This was a way of putting together. Here's my taste. Here's my particular identity presented to you in something that is mine. No company has gotten behind me to do this. This is purely something that is perhaps a vanity project of my own and an expression of my personality. And of course that can become a fetish as we need more and more things to less in terms of the aesthetic value of them in our experience listening, but just to bring them in and see them again as extensions of our bodies, extensions of our experience.
The most fun is I get to travel around the world and meet audiophiles, but when I go to their homes, I see their record collection, I can start looking through it and know who they are on a certain level, know what their tastes are, not just in music, but generally. And I find it fascinating to go to people's homes and see a huge record collection, none of which I've ever seen. And I've got a lot of records. It's just there's so many of them out there. And they tend to concentrate and congregate in different people's homes based upon a whole variety of tastes and ideas.
Well, there is a literature, and I'm not an expert on it, so what I'm getting ready to say is the extent of my knowledge. But there is a literature of collecting as performance. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if any of you guys know about that, but I had a student last spring who did a master's thesis about a woman who collected, they weren't records, but it was all kinds of found objects, and then displayed them throughout her house. And a good half of her paper was about collecting as performance, and there was a pretty long academic literature on it. And I could see that, I guess, with records. I never thought about that until I was sitting right here. But given how beautiful the album covers are, how large they are, it seems to me there could be a performance quality, and I'm doing it myself, I realize. I have thousands of records and CDs, but mostly the records, it seems, have that kind of quality more than the CDs, which don't have that warm.
How important is the particular vehicle to the music? I mean, obviously, you don't only want to listen to music recorded before World War II on 78s. On the other hand, you'd like them to be mastered from the best possible 78s. One of the things that we're constantly running into, Michael is the great authority on this, but I mean, all of us, my generation grew up with a horrific thing called electrically rechanneled for stereo, which just destroyed some of the greatest music ever. And we're all experiencing that now with compression, MP3s, iTunes. We had in the Graduate Center, Manfred Eicher was here, who created ECM Records. And he said, I don't have anything against iTunes, I just won't let them put out my music because it doesn't sound, we spend hours and hours trying to create a sound, and they are incapable of selling it.
And it's important. That's what's gotten lost. Sound is important. Good sound, to hear music properly, is an important thing. And it's gotten lost. And if you talk about it with people, they don't want to.
So I spent 12 years studying a building on 6th Avenue and 28th Street, kind of living 50 or 60 years ago. And at the end of that, I was dying to document something that was happening today. And so I've just recently started a project documenting contemporary musicians, mostly through interviews so far, and recordings of their rehearsals. And some of them are the Wordless Music Orchestra and Ensemble Signal, some of the state-of-the-art kind of alt classical, if you will. They actually hate that term, but or new music ensembles. And the musicians are all under 40, if not 30. And I just spent a week with Wordless 2 weeks ago. And one of the questions we ask every one of them is, how do you listen to music? And every one of them listened to records. And it was remarkable. And even, so I'm not all that knowledgeable in this, but you can get new records of, almost every, the other thing about this group of people is they're not just listening to classical music, but they're listening to avant-garde rock. And you can get avant-garde rock that I am really new to on vinyl. And so these, some of them are 20 years old, 25 years old, and every one of them, independently of the others, said that's vinyl record was how they listened to their music these days.
I sat with a string player in the Vienna Philharmonic who told me that half the string players in the Vienna Philharmonic prefer vinyl because it makes the strings sound more natural, which CDs don't do.
Yeah, these musicians said it was the sonic quality, but it was also the focus of putting something on, the act of it, sitting in front of the speakers, and it was the focus too.
Yeah, that's what we always used. That was just the way you did it, and then it got lost.
Right.
And now it's being rediscovered again. Just maybe sitting and eating a meal will be rediscovered by a young generation. They just eat on the run. So, oh, wait, you can actually sit down and eat a meal.
You write about being nostalgic for CDs, which I fell on the floor, and I didn't know that was humanly possible to be nostalgic for CDs.
Right.
But I think that's a generational thing because we each grew up with a different kind of a media. Let's talk about the significance of them and why they're important. Mm-hmm. I think we should begin with 78s. One of the things that we've learned about 78s in recent years, because now there's a famous story about Columbia Records hiring guys with sledgehammers to destroy thousands and thousands of original parts and 78s to clear space because they had been digitalized. And now we're finding operations. It started in England, I think, with a man named John R.T. Davies, but there's a company in the Midwest called Off the Record that's been doing this, where you take the best possible 78 you can find, and for each 78, because 78s, every 78 has a different size groove. The space between the grooves, those valleys, are different depending on the dynamics, whether it's loud or soft. And what they do is they design a different needle for each particular 78 because all that information is in the groove. And if the needle is up tight against both sides, it brings out more information than if you just play it with a conventional needle. So they've been doing this. It's painstaking work, as you can imagine, and the results are breathtaking. We're hearing things that we didn't know were there. So you talk as an archivist about how do we conserve that? Where do we conserve it?
First of all, the technology, and beyond what R.T. Davies is doing, the Library of Congress has a machine called Irene, which is basically an optical transfer machine that does it all by laser. Of course, their laser turntables have been out for a number of years, but Irene seems to be the most advanced machine that is doing this purely by laser. Of course, it's not remotely anywhere near being on the market. We can't do it ourselves. And we can't take our records to Culpeper, Virginia and have them do it for us, unfortunately. For me, I think that, and again, when we talk about 78s, a lot of us end up talking about blues and old-time country and jazz records, where we should be talking about all the ethnic records made in America and abroad and any number of pop records and bizarre music hall records from England and whatever else. But I think that, and Amanda writes about, and he shows up a lot in Amanda's book, a fellow named Chris King, who's a friend of ours in Faber, Virginia, who's one of the foremost collectors specifically of pre-war jazz and country and Cajun music. And there's something about the rarity of 78s in particular with regard to particular genres, especially Cajun and pre-war country and blues records and jazz records, that each one almost is embedded in it is the story of its provenance. And there's an incredible story that I think John Jeremiah Sullivan first told in his essay called Unknown Bards for Harper's, that Chris King was sort of looking, had his fourth bottle of wine that night, and he was looking at I guess it was the Geeshie Wiley record.
Yeah.
And he was sort of parsing out the best way to make a transfer, and he realized by whatever means that the best way to do it, it looked like the groove wear was sort of on this side, the outer side of the groove, and he realized, or thought, he hypothesized, that it was probably had been played in a shack on obviously a wind-up Victrola with a dull needle, and likely the floor was slanted towards you, so the record was sort of, the needle was dragging on this end, and maybe people danced as it was going on, as was their wont, because these weren't records sold for preservation's sake. And so what he did is he tilted everything back and chose the right stylus, so the information pulled off the transfer dragged on the other side of the groove, on the internal side of the groove. And there's something about that, all of those, and again, they're just hypotheses, but the lessons or just the stories potentially told by a single 78, of course that's one of 2 or 3 known copies in existence, and then getting that information pristinely, more pristine than anyone else had before. Something about that is so uncommonly rare and sublime that, it moves one to fetish for sure.
And it's really an art, right? I mean, doing that work well, that kind of engineering work or that remastering work. There's a moment early on in my book where I'm interviewing, one of my first interviews with a record collector, and I ask him, do you think record collecting is a dying art? And he says, I think it's funny that you call it an art. I think it's a sickness.
There you go, self-loathing. Yes.
Which is later maybe proven true by some other stories in the book. But when I encounter a guy like Chris, I do really, I mean, the first time I saw Chris do that, kind of adjust the stylus, put a different size needle on his turntable, put like a popsicle stick on the thing to weigh it down. I mean, it is a transformative listening experience, and it does feel to me like an art. It feels like a magic trick, or I think in the book I even talk about it as a conjuring. It feels like you're hearing something for the first time. I mean, and that was incredible. I think the first time he did it for me was with a Robert Johnson record that I'd heard a million times before. I'd heard good remasters of that record. And hearing that 78, I mean, being played, a few feet in front of me, and I didn't think I would be destroyed by it, and I was. I mean, it was like I'd never heard the song before.
The thing is always the best way to hear it, what it originally was. I mean, it's good to be archived and preserved, but when you hear the thing itself played back properly, it's just the best experience. And even vinyl, which is a relatively recent thing, 50 years maybe, you know, if you play that back correctly, it's amazing. The people that made those records had no idea how good it sounded. Mm-hmm. Now you can first hear it.
Yeah.
But we're talking about preserving American music. And you're getting to the area of preserving the correct sound of the music, which is, I think the two are inseparable. You're talking about vinyl. If it's the original album, that's the best way to hear it. And yet, you just showed me an illustration a few minutes ago of a record comes out in 1950, one kind of vinyl, and then it's reissued 3 years later by the same company, and there's a diminishment.
Well, that happens. That can happen. It can also get better. I mean, there's better and worse. There are reissues coming out now that sound better than the originals, and there are some that are not as good. It all depends. The Blue Notes that are coming out now, I think, actually sound better, a lot of them, than the originals that Rudy Van Gelder cut, because when he cut them, he had to make them playable on the average guy's turntable, and it couldn't skip out of the groove, which it would if there was a lot of bass information on there. So he would put some compression in it. Mm-hmm. Now they can take the tape and cut it completely flat with no compression, all the bass, and it sounds very close to the master tape. So, you know, there's better and worse depending upon the time, but there's no hard and fast rule.
In situations where we don't have the master tape, I mean, this is what's really interesting to me, is who gets to make those decisions, right? About what's the right way to hear this record, what's the right way for it to sound. I mean, engineers ultimately end up doing that. Collectors, to an extent, get to curate those stories. I mean, it's when you think about the sort of burden of responsibility and who it falls on, it's really interesting.
Well, the
It
question
becomes a commercial decision.
The question is, what is the tabula rasa? Is it the first pressing or is it the tape? Now, you know, Roy Dunan at Contemporary, he automatically raised the high frequencies when he recorded, and then he cut them back when they cut lacquers. So if you took the original tape and cut it flat, you had the wrong thing. You had to know what the notes were when it was originally made. So all that kind of research has to be done when it's on tape to know what the right thing to do with the tape is. When they did the Beatles recently, Steve Berkowitz sat there with all the original mastering notes and all the original notes, and even the Beatles were saying, well, cut this bass a little bit, add that. And he went back and tried to make it sound like those records sounded like. And he succeeded. They're unbelievable, those records.
But you would argue that, and I think you should explain this argument because we've been dancing
How much time
around
do
it
you have?
without saying it. Vinyl is the best way of hearing.
That's how I hear it, and it's not because I'm old and I always liked vinyl. You know, when the CD came out, I was all for it, you know, because you wouldn't have to clean your records and there wouldn't be distortion. There were all these problems related to vinyl. But when I first heard it, it was terrible, and it got somewhat better, but it never got great. And now we have high-resolution digital audio. It's much better. Right. I still think records sound of analog material. When you digitize analog, something gets lost. It's like when a film gets put on video. It can be great, but it looks different, and it's not the same.
We have a friend in the audience, Fred Kaplan, distinguished writer and another audiophile. He mentioned to me that the company that you often write about, Acoustic Sounds, was coming out with one of my very favorite albums, Ellington Masterpieces, which was the first album for which a composer actually wrote music for the LP length. He wrote 15-minute arrangements of 4 pieces. And that's the original cover, the red. I'd never seen that before this evening. The one behind it is the one that I bought when I was a kid, and it's known to collectors as a 6-size.
6-size,
because it was made when Columbia's logo had 6 CBS eyes on it. And Fred said they're coming out with completely remastered at 45 RPM, but you may not need it if you have the original 6 eyes. And I know this record cold. I paid to have it transcribed when we had the American Jazz Orchestra.
And the sound is
amazing. But I will tell you that it's scary how good the sound is. I've never heard a CD that just shook the room, and this is 1950.
50, because it was recorded right to tape with very simple equipment, a very simple board, a couple of microphones, tube microphones, and a tube board, and write to tape, and that's it. That's why.
Now, explain acoustic recording, because that is the most pure of, that would be the most pure of all, right?
And when you hear a good, I'm sure you've heard a lot of those things, where there's no electronics involved at all. It's basically a cutting stylus and someone screaming into a horn, and that's literally pushing the cutting stylus, and then when you play it back, it's literally doing it in the other direction. And I've heard some of those where they open a door, and it sounds like there's a little man standing there singing. There's no bass, there's no treble, but right in the human voice area, it's eerie, and I'm sure you've heard plenty of those things. It's amazing, within the limitations.
But the only mixing you do is deciding where everybody stands.
Well, that's right. That's why there's a very famous Duke Ellington record that came out on CD where they had different cutting systems in the same room, and they realized if they synced them together, they could get stereo.
Stereo from 1932.
Amazing.
How expensive is that now?
What?
That process?
Of doing what? Recording
Yeah,
acoustically?
yeah.
I don't think anybody's doing it, but it shouldn't, I know I was down at the Edison Center and they let us make our own acoustic recording and hear our own voice back, and it was pretty eerie to hear it. I mean, there's problems with it, there's noises and things, but the actual voice itself sounds, but I'm glad we're past that. I'm much happier where we are right now.
When we talk about old movies, especially from the first 30 or 40 years, the majority are gone. They're lost forever. We don't really have that problem with recordings except during the Edison era. Those are pretty much all gone.
And the tapes, the universal tapes.
And tapes. Talk about the fire and then...
Well, in the a lot of the record companies do keep their tapes very securely and under good conditions. Columbia does, and when RCA and Sony got together, they're in Iron Mountain, they're stored correctly. But on the West Coast, when Universal went on a big buying spree and bought Chess and Motown and Impulse and many other labels, they stored them for some reason that no one can understand on top of the mountain there where Universal Studios is and where the amusement park is. And they had a big fire, and a large percentage of those master tapes are gone. And they don't want to talk about it, but they're gone. The Chess catalog, the Motown catalog, I mean, it is a terrible tragedy, but they're gone.
All right, but given the fact that the vast majority of recordings made after the cylinder era are with us because collectors saved as many as they could, the sheer number of them is beyond belief, especially if you think internationally. What responsibility do you as a curator see for, do we keep them all? Absolutely. Is there a question of discrimination? No, absolutely.
No, absolutely not. And this is why I think private and public partnerships are so crucial. For example, one that I think is almost there, and you're seeing a shift, I think, in this. The R. Hooley Foundation, which is, well, the R. Hooley Record Company, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, started by Chris Strakwitz, an Austrian immigrant to the States in the late 50s. Chris, in the mid-80s, somehow, living in El Cerrito, California in the East Bay, got super into norteño music, Tex-Mex music, border music, and started collecting first 78s, which were still sort of easy to find in the early, I guess, late 70s, early 80s. And then started collecting cassettes, LPs, 45s. And with the support of a number of foundations over the years, has done this massive transfer job of all of this media of border music. He doesn't speak a word of Spanish, but he likes it. And no one was doing this work. There was no institution that wasn't even on their radar. And he got in touch with UCLA, and through whatever machination, UCLA then has supported the continuing preservation of this and ultimately will be hosting the online presentation of it. So all of this music with all associated metadata, artist name, performance title, date, label, everything that you can find basically, it's on the record or without, will be presented online. The problem is that a lot of people were still really afraid about the real or imagined threat of lawsuits. So commercially released material is not coming online as fast as it might because especially institutions are, their general counsels are saying, don't do this, you're putting yourself in the line of fire. I hope in the coming years, and the Library of Congress's National Jukebox is doing this with sort of acoustic era material, largely through the support of Universal, that these things will be available again through a private-public partnership that collectors or even bigger labels can donate their materials, still claiming the copyright on them in the case of Universal, or in the case of Chris Strakwitz and R. Hooley, they did the work. Now institutions can use their their computer acumen, obviously their bandwidth, their IT support to make them available. It has to be that way because institutions won't. I mean, we at the Alan Lomax Archive, I will say, and I don't say this self-aggrandizingly, we took under the direction of Anna Lomax, Alan's daughter in the late 90s, took the initiative to digitize all of Lomax's collections. But it was a closed collection. All of them, by and large, were made by Alan Lomax. They were not commercially released recordings originally. Much easier to do. We've brought things online, again, with permission from some other collectors that make up a portion of the collection. And then we've been partnering with the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress that assumed the physical preservation burden of this stuff 10 years ago. I think that kind of initiative will be the future for this stuff. But we absolutely have to, stop denigrating collectors if that in fact happens. We have to make collectors know that their collections are important and that are valued outside of their tiny community, so they know that institutions will be interested in supporting them and the stuff can be preserved. Absolutely everything, no matter how bad it is, should be preserved. And there are a lot of really bad records. We forget how bad a lot of music from the 78 era are. Some records are rare because they were no good to begin with.
What are the largest archives right now?
The largest archives, I would say the Library of Congress has recorded, the Sound and the AV Archive at Culpeper, Virginia is probably the biggest.
Which one?
The Sound Archive of the Library of Congress in Culpeper, Virginia, where everything's held now.
Right.
I imagine is the biggest in the States, certainly.
And they will take everything?
Well, they won't. You can't just sort of make a donation quite like that. We sort of rely, I think, for example, the American Folklife Center works with collectors to accession their collections. For example, the Southern Folklife Collection at UNC, which has an incredible collection of not just pre-war blues and country 78s, but also tape recordings from the 50s and 60s of bluegrass bands and interviews with artists and all manner of Carolina soul and all this sort of thing, is doing a really good job seeking out collectors and accessioning their collections. And I think there has to be a little more of a progressive approach made by institutions to seek out collections, especially in the places where they come from.
This is going to become an increasingly big problem because my generation is the vinyl generation. And we're all thinking about what's going to happen to these records. The people that you spoke to, this must have been an issue haunting them.
Well, certainly. It's a burden on an institution. And some of the places Nathan is talking about are doing a fantastic job at sort of keeping up with it. But shellac is really hard to store. It's it's heavy, it's fragile, it's complicated. You need to pay someone to catalog and to do the transfers and to make it available digitally. A lot of institutions don't necessarily have the funding to kind of keep up with it. It is. I think it's like a 2-ton albatross in many cases. I've heard collectors talk about their collections that way. Many of them will have specific things that they want to have happen to their records after they die. But again, and the reason I actually first met Nathan was because he became the kind of material warden of a collection that had been of a guy named Don Wall, who was a record collector who lived in Louisville, Kentucky, had a really incredible collection of pre-war country 78s. And when he died, he was estranged from his family, and they just had, ordered for the kind of junking of his entire house. All those records got tossed in a dumpster. Thankfully, somebody knew to call this gentleman, and he, resurrected many of those records that would have otherwise been lost. But I'm certain that's happening all the time. People don't really know what to do with these things. They're heavy, they're complicated, they're hard to sell,
not just
they're hard
records.
to keep.
Yeah.
Right, all
Everything.
kinds of important material.
The past is disposable, but less so now than it was, let's say, 40 years ago, because those Columbia records that were they were going over to Carnegie Hall to start on that, but they got stopped.
Well, another big problem is with scores, orchestral scores. They've been incinerated. Families find them in the basement, and the band leader died 30 years ago, and they're tired of storing it, and they don't know who to call. It seems to me that this is a real problem, that there should be some kind of a repository. Because one thing that's true about collectors is that they don't want to see their collection, if it's a great collection, go piecemeal. It has some integrity that they would like to keep it. And I'm amazed at how few universities in the country have put aside sections of their libraries to preserve this material.
A friend of mine is the chairman of the English department at the College of the South, Sewanee, and he's an audiophile, and he ended up with the record and CD collection of the Archbishop of Canterbury, for one reason or another, who had quite a collection. And he took part of the library and got the alumni to donate $500,000, and he made a big sound listening room in there with a huge stereo and I went down there and set up the turntables for them. And they bring the kids in there to listen to the music and experience it, and it's a wonderful thing. There should be more of that.
Sam, I want to talk about start with you. I think everybody will have something to say about this. The question of audiophile progress versus sheer convenience. I thought the low point for convenience in my lifetime was 8-track. But even though I love the iPod, I think that the MP3s are a kind of a cancer on people being able to hear nuance and warmth in music. I just want to read a short paragraph. This is from my Crosby book, but it says something about what people used to go through to hear music as opposed to Spotify and iTunes and all of this. It's about Dinah Shore. I think you all remember Dinah Shore. She was a pop singer and a TV star. And she and another pop singer of the 1940s named Trudy Irwin happened to meet on the street in New York City in 1942, and they were both feeling lonely. And Dinah mentioned that she was carrying records. This is almost like carrying dope, and because it was a big thing. So Trudy Irwin got all excited, and they decided that after they finished their respective sets with their orchestras, they would meet up in Dinah's room at the Waldorf, and they would listen to records. And I write, Dinah's record collection merits comment. Many musicians lugged their favorite records on the road. The other musicians in the band or on the tour generally knew who was carrying and what they carried. This was no small thing. Records were transported in heavy boxes built to hold 25 or 50 78 RPM discs, each weighing nearly half a pound. One filled the box to capacity to diminish chipping and outright breakage. A box of 50 records, 2 songs each, the equivalent of 4 compact discs, or 1/4% the capacity of an iPod Classic, measured a foot high and 6 inches deep and weighed 30 pounds. Even with layers of protective wadding, it was too fragile to entrust to porters and bellhops. And I wonder, when you put so much effort into having those records, do you treasure the music more as well as the disc? Do you listen harder?
Well, I back to this project I'm working on now that I just started, interviewing a lot of these young, contemporary new music musicians and avant-garde rock musicians who are in their 20s and 30s at the most. I'm really heartened by what's going on right now because they are listening to records. They are doing that, doing that cumbersome thing. They're buying the equipment. They're listening to records. But they also are doing a lot of the convenient thing too. And what I think I'm hearing so far is that the quick access to such a enormous range of music, like they can, like a 15-year-old now can access Turkish music or anything instantly. And there are definitely drawbacks to that, but I think we'll see 25 years from now if this period with this access plus the savoring of good quality sound, if there's something new that might combust out of this current period. I'm actually heartened because it seems like some of these young musicians are doing both.
Yeah, I think the access is incredible. I mean, the best we could do was those Evertone sheets that came in records, that were the black things you'd pull out. It was, you put a nickel on the stylus, maybe it would play. But you can listen to anything now. So since they know what quality is, they can access new music and then go out and find the real thing. And that's what's fantastic.
And they can break down barriers. I mean, there's certain iconographic barriers that set up. And you mentioned that the decision was a commercial one. Iconography is nothing but a commercial interest. And so a lot of barriers to entry contributed to barriers of category or style of music, and that's totally broken down now. And I think we're finding in these young musicians that they're blending so many different things, and that's because of the MP3. That's not a bad thing, but I'm like I said, I think that they're also kind of the crazy person in the basement too. There's a little bit of quality that I'm finding in these youngsters. That I'm enjoying.
And that's
the
spreading.
irony of the MP3 is that it sort of replicates the experience of 78s in the sense that we're talking about single tracks instead of albums, which we were talking about for almost half a century. Do any of you know about the Paramount, the rise and fall of Paramount Records that Revenant put out in?
The box, yeah.
Yeah.
You've seen it?
I've seen it. I don't own it, but I've seen it.
For those of you who've not seen it, and it sells for $500 and it's volume 1, it's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. It's a huge handmade wooden, have you seen it?
Yes.
You're laughing. You must
got
have.
one.
Both have copies.
It's a
We've
wooden
got
box.
Of course we do.
You open it up and it has a handmade wooden LP cover that's very fragile. And there were 6 LPs of Paramount blues classics, not restored. But that's okay. The sound is typical, nothing spectacular. But there's something about the way they've designed the discs that's pretty, your heart does leap a little bit when you see them. There's also 2 like 500-page books that are astonishing, discographies, all of that. But the main thing, after you've dug out the 6 LPs and dug out the books, is a flash drive. 3-inch flash drive that has 800 tracks.
MP3
I don't even
track.
know how to interpret that.
I think one of them is a collector's item that you will just put on the wall, and one of them is what you're actually going to play. I think that's what they're thinking. And those records were pressed at United, which is not a particularly good pressing plant, so it's good to have the flash drive.
Right, I mean, and there's really no other way to give people 800 songs. I mean, if we're talking about practicality, right? I mean, the flash drive is not, at least you get the 800 songs, as opposed to however many are on the 6 LPs. I don't know.
I wrote a review of that set, or a piece about it for the Oxford American when it came out, so I'm sort of quoting myself, but I was going to say, I think the most, in a way, crucially, fundamentally, they're sort of making fun of themselves in that set. You go through all this trouble, and the thing really is, it's like 33 pounds. You go through all the trouble of taking out all of these extremely precious objects, precious not in the sense that they're in fact of value, but they're preciously designed, to get to what is, I guess, a brass reproduction of an original Paramount portable phonographs needle assembly. I mean, it's bizarre, and then you stick it into your computer. And to me, there's a sense, there's a realization, there's an admittance that ultimately, when everything else in this set, disintegrates, falls apart, the white birch folio, crumbles in your fingers, all those MP3s will have been reproduced untold amounts of times online, and they'll all be available there. In a way, they're giving the world a gift in, granted, only 320 kbps MP3s, but they'll be out there, and you'll be able to get them without spending a dime. And in a way, I feel like they're sort of having it both ways. They're making the contribution at the same time they're giving a tip of the hat to the collectors. If I may, I wanted to say an ancillary to this that I find really interesting. And of course, I'm inclined to disparage MP3s as well, although on the Alan Lomax Archive's website, we stream all of his recordings from 1946 through 1991 in MP3 format. But there was a young collector and a curator and a field recordist named Chris Kirkley, who lives in Portland, Oregon. And he does a label called Music from Saharan Cell Phones, or it's called Sahel Sounds. And he travels around West Africa and the Sahel region in western Niger, making recordings, contemporary recordings with good gear of contemporary artists. But he also collects, as someone would collect records, the flashcards in cell phones. And this is primarily a nomadic region still, and folks are coming in and out. It's a sort of a crossing for a lot of populations in West Africa. And he's made a couple albums of the music that he's collected off these cell phones. And it is, you have never heard, first of all, the quality is just abysmal, but that's not the point. It's like 32K MP3s in some cases. But you've never heard it's both canned music that was ripped 9 times through various cassette iterations and whatever else till they ended up on people's cell phones, but also new music that is recorded on cell phones for distribution over cell phones. So the cell phone is the only means of music distribution in the Western Sahel. And I strongly recommend listening to that music because in a way, and again, all of these musics go there bootlegged on bootleg cassettes, and it's sort of the place where all music goes to be rid of all of its cultural emplacements and just distributed willy-nilly throughout the population. And there's a story that, and I'll stop, but there's a friend of mine who's a photographer originally who's in North Carolina who was there in the Western Sahel a few years ago doing field work. And the only music that their driver had, the only music he ever listened to was the 20-second ringtone of Eddie Rabbit, the guy who sang I Love a Rainy Night, on his cell phone. It was the only music he had, and he loved it. He treasured it because it was all he had.
Lucky for him, he treasured it.
I'm going to take some questions, but while you're queuing, those of you who have questions, the 2 microphones, let me ask the big question. the biggest of all that everything else is sort of subordinate to, and that is, what do we do to create a cultural memory of all of this music? Because it doesn't really exist. In most of the United States, I know very well you can go to your grave and never know what jazz, never hear it, never know what it is. I was once on a talk show in Bismarck, North Dakota, South Dakota, whatever Dakota Bismarck is in, and it was a live afternoon show, and the woman had never heard of Duke Ellington or Count Basie. And I said something awkward because I wasn't there when the commercial was over. This seems to me to be a serious issue. I mean, we've just been talking about Paramount Blues records. These were made for partying. They were made for dancing. We listen to them now and we hear a whole era coming to life. They're like news bulletins in some ways about the mores of a period. Should this only be of interest to collectors?
No,
I think what do we do to expand a sense of what American music really is?
I'm not sure we have to do that much because I think it's spreading by itself. It's just like there was a period of time when I said, how are we going to save records? I got to help save records. And enough young people picked up on it. And I think there's a whole generation that are out there exploring all this stuff. And they're not letting the past go. They're interested in it. And I think they will keep it going. I think, and all the communication is allowing that to happen. So I'm very optimistic about none of this stuff is going to end up in a corner where no one sees it. It's going to be out there. That's what I think.
You sort of lived with this, with the Loft Project, finding things that nobody knew existed.
Well, that's true. I mean, and that took, what that took was a really generous angel donor out of Chicago, or that project never would have happened.
Could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, it's 6th Avenue, 821 6th Avenue, in between 28th and 29th. The photographer, W. Eugene Smith, lived there, and between 1957 and 1965, he wired the building from the sidewalk to the 5th floor and made 4,500 hours of what amount to urban field recordings. And there's Thelonious Monk in there, there's huge iconic figures, and there are also a lot of musicians that no one's ever heard of, including a lot of the musicians that were there couldn't even remember them. And then there's a lot of things off radio and TV which really kind of cement the material in the time in a really unique way. So what do you do with 4,500 hours? And that project took 12 years, and some of the things you mentioned, Gary, about the big problem of it, the standards in the project, the preservation standards within my project changed. And we didn't get all the money at once, so we were told by the National Endowment for Humanities, this is how you do it at this point, and then 3 years later, wait a minute, no, you have to do it a different way. And then and those standards changing aren't for, there are substantive reasons why the standards change, but it makes it hard, it makes it more expensive, more time consuming. There's no way the Jazz Loft Project would have happened if it hadn't been for this family, the Logan family out of Chicago. So it takes money. And in order to preserve something like that, because it was, I wanted to pick up on something Nathan said about bad music. Bad music is really important because you don't get to hear it 50 years later. And one of the things these loft tapes offer is an extraordinary amount of really bad music, and often played by really great musicians. And I played these tapes for some conservatory classes up here, and the musicians who were 18, 19, they were heartened to hear that you didn't have to play perfectly all the time, which is what a history told from the point of view of the most sensational recordings tells them. So they loved hearing the bad music, because they're not all that great all the time either. But it takes a lot of money, unfortunately.
Good evening. How you doing, Gary? I have a question about high-res audio. But first, let me preface it with an anecdote. Back in the 80s, I attended a big event that Bose had with an uncle of mine who was an audiophile. And I remember going to this event, and these Bose speakers were all over the place, and it was a transformative experience. And I just remember my uncle standing there going, fabulous, fabulous. So I had a recent experience, in fact, last week, that was similar. As Gary knows, I'm a jazz writer and jazz critic. And so I was invited to go to Avatar Studios to the playing of the recording by Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett. And Sony Audio, they were one of the sponsors of this event, and they had their high-res audio equipment there. And the sound was phenomenal. I put on the speakers, I put on the headphones, and it was just marvelous. So you're the only one who mentioned high-res audio. So I want you to talk about that from a sound perspective and also in terms of preservation. One of the things they were saying, now of course they were trying to hawk it, that's their prerogative, but they were saying that this captures more of what audio engineers and sound people and the musicians, what they were really trying to put out here. It captures it and it renders it more accurately. So is that true? And what do you think?
The CD was always a very compromised format. It really wasn't even invented to be a sonic step up from vinyl, actually. It was invented to be easier to use, more music in a small space, put it in the car. The size was designed to fit into the dashboard of a car. So the sound was compromised. When it was declared archival, that's when I, when I went crazy. It was a big lie. And I literally dropped everything I was doing to try to save records and to make people understand that we shouldn't be archiving the history of recorded music onto CD resolution. It would be a disaster.
Did that happen because of convenience, for space reasons?
It happened for a couple of reasons. First, because they need a new format every 20 years.
So that people will buy again the records that they've already bought.
Cassettes actually are what killed records in a lot of ways, and that people would get rid of their records to have cassettes, which you'd see on the highway and attached to cars. That was ridiculous, but that's what happened. And then the CD came out, had a lot of good qualities, one of which was not that it was forever, because we know that there's like 2 billion unplayable CDs in this country. High resolution audio takes things beyond, they said, well, if we can't hear above 20,000 hertz, so we can have a brick wall filter there, which is necessary for CDs, and we won't miss anything. But there's an incredible amount of information above that we don't hear in terms of amplitude, but we sense, our minds can hear it in terms of space and in terms of the timing cues. And so what you're hearing, what's making you excited by hearing high resolution audio is a combination of more extended high frequencies and the timing issues that is what we survived with over a long period of time. And that's cut off on a CD. That's why people stopped listening to music, I believe. They put a CD on and in 2 minutes you go, what else can I do? Or I'll have music in the background while I do something else. That's why when a kid hears a record and it's got this much better sonics, they sit there and they listen the way we did when we were young.
Well, when the CDs first came out, they were using these consoles to take off the surface noise. It was supposed to be a big deal that they're getting rid of surface noise. Well, the only way you could get rid of surface noise is if you also get rid of certain frequencies in the high and the low. And they put out Benny Goodman's Carnegie Hall record from 1938, and they cut out so many frequencies that the guitar breaks are not there. It's just space.
The hall wasn't there either. There was no hall. They just cut all that stuff out. But you heard a studio, what a studio can sound like. And I can't say too many good things about Bose either, but that's a whole nother story. But no, this is going to change things. If people hear high resolution files, I don't think that they will have any problem hearing the improvement and sensing the improvement. Even though the self-solving audio files online, everybody's saying it's a scam, CDs are perfect, it doesn't need to be any better. Only in audio do you have that problem. Nobody in video says, better picture, it's a scam. No, everybody can see a better picture. And I think everybody can hear the difference. You heard it. I'm glad you did.
Thank you.
One of you mentioned, I don't remember which one it was, that some woman you saw had a major museum-type collection of an old blues singer in her house, and it was like a museum. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, we have an Enrico Caruso museum. The guy turned the second floor of his house into this thing. And if you didn't hear about it through word of mouth, you didn't know about it. I wonder if a thought is, a T.J. Lubinsky or someone, with what he's done for doo-wop music on Channel 13, go to visit some of these specialized collections, and how do you get exposure? By doing a special television show and putting it on so people are exposed to the music and find out about these specialized collections, because who's going to know on what block in the city or in what town any of these collections exist? It's not like a college, Queens College, the curator for the Louis Armstrong House. Or a Duke University or University of North Carolina preserving someone's collection. Is that a possibility to think in terms of folks like you, even going to PBS and saying, how about doing a story on these specialized collections and people who have these house collections?
There should be a TV show, or there's TV shows with all kinds of stupid subjects. Monster this and big that. How about monster record collections come to eat you? Something like that. I think a lot of people would watch something like that. But then again, it's us. So maybe the rest.
We do have hoarders. Maybe as close as we come.
That's one of the
I mean,
hoarders.
certainly that's a challenge. I think getting private collections to be public in a way, or getting people to know that these recordings are available. I mean, I think one could possibly argue that the culture, in so much as it is the culture's responsibility to kind of memorialize itself, that it does sort of pick the things that it wants to have endure. But it is a challenge. I mean, in many ways, I feel like records, and maybe Nathan could argue or agree, records that are accessible in private collections almost felt to me like they were easier to get to than some of the records that get institutionally buried and aren't even cataloged. I mean, the New York Public Library is a sort of great and tragic example of that has, tons of records. But there, if you go to the library and you say, I want to browse the 78 collection, there's a kind of ancient microfiche, it hasn't been updated in forever, and it certainly contains only a very small fraction of the records that the library actually holds. And even then, if you find a record on their microfiche and you say, bring me this record, they may or may not be able to find it. So often when things are held by private collectors who feel really strongly about the material they have, it's almost easier to find it that way. I don't know if that's been true for you too. It was for me, at least in the reporting of my book.
I agree, and I also think that you are absolutely right. There needs to be some kind of mechanism, God knows how to do it, of preserving not just collections, but the collections as they were envisioned and spatially arranged by the collectors. Because I'm sure that as an Enrico Caruso fanatic, expert, whatever he is, he makes connections in his own collection, in his space, that an institution would not do in their card catalog or their any kind of digital catalog, any kind of record that they would put together digitally that would need to rely on matrix numbers or label numbers or chronology or whatever else. And Amanda's book does this really well, I think, in getting into the rooms of the collectors and seeing what's where and the way things are juxtaposed. But I think a lot of this comes down to genre. As things go into institutions, they get parsed out into particular genres. And of course, this was happening in the 1920s when the commercial labels realized there were specific markets for black music and Cajun music and hillbilly music and ethnic music and whatever else. And for me, I feel like there's so many lessons super musical to be learned by the ways who was playing with one another, who was collecting what where. The people that only had 3 or 5 records in their collections, what were they? Alan Lomax, when he was in East Kentucky in 1937, talked about how a lot of these hillbillies, as they would have been known then, they went crazy for blues and mountain music, but they loved Guy Lombardo and Bing Crosby. I mean, we forget that those records were there too. And I think that all of those sort of almost untranslatable or uncatalogable, unpresentable connections that are made on the micro level, there has to be a way to do it. I don't know if American Pickers is the way to do that, but there should be, I agree.
Jerry Mulligan, a great jazz musician, had a huge vinyl collection. And it's a perfect example of what you're talking about, because it would almost be impossible for a civilian to walk in there and have any idea of the way they're ordered. It started out as alphabetized, but every time he'd play a record, he'd put it under the name of whoever played best on the record.
That's fantastic. You'd never want to break that up. I mean, that's...
And he remembered where everyone was, He wanted to play something for me that Jack Teagarden had done, and he said, it's over there under the W's. Because it was on a Ben Webster record, or Ben Webster was on the record, and Webster was, as far as he was concerned, the best soloist on that session. So, just knowing that, if you could, and his entire collection is in the Library of Congress, but they just
That's
they
the
just
problem.
put it down.
Yeah.
But if you understood that, you could really get a very interesting sense of the way he thought as an artist.
That's amazing.
Oh, just one thing. I went to CDs when my little children had managed to pull needles across lovely LPs. So that was, I think, LPs in houses with children were not quite fit. My question is, I have some, not terribly many cylinders. I have never heard them. I don't really know what good condition they are, if any, or if they are playable. But I don't know. Is there some group out there that would? How are they? How is the quality of the ideal cylinder? Do they have nuances on them or not? But is there some place that would just love my cylinders? Or
You have cylinders?
I have cylinders, yeah.
But you don't have a means of playing them.
I have a machine that would play them that is broken. And I think it needs a new band, the sort of elastic. Yeah.
Wow.
That's fixable. I mean,
Yeah,
certainly
it's
fixable.
fixable. Yeah, I hadn't really dared to try that. I thought that.
Does any of the cylinders say Buddy Bolden? No.
The Library of Congress did instate, and I can't remember when, at least 15 years ago, a federal cylinder preservation project. I think in collaboration with maybe UCLA or someone on the West Coast. Unfortunately, with cylinders, it's because they were largely etched into, the sound was etched into wax. That, first of all, I mean, the recording technology was extremely primitive. But with every play, just like playing a Victrola without changing your needle, every playback is diminished. And again, I think part of the problem is that when the Library of Congress gets a copy of a record, any future copies that come in of that record, they get sold or they get thrown away or whatever else. So if you have common cylinders, or even not common cylinders, but they already have 2 copies or something, I don't know if they would take them. It's a problem because I get calls a lot about 78s, and I go and, it was a beloved Aunt 78 collection, and she loved her records, and you go through them, and they really are, if they're not terrible music, it's all Doris Day and it's all Harry James and whatever else, which is fine. It's not my taste, but there is no place to put them. There's no one wants them. And I hope there will come a time that maybe, who knows, maybe every library will say, local library says, I don't know, we'll install a 78 listening center for the hell of it. But until then, it's tough, yeah.
Okay, so if they had odd taste, I don't know, then maybe the Library of Congress.
Maybe, well, because they become rarer then, frankly. But there was, just for example, last year there was a cylinder of a Black Jubilee group recorded in the 1890s, whose name I now forget, but this was found in Maine of all places, and I think, it fetched $9,000 somewhere. They can be rare if that's, of interest to you.
Know of any other places that just might, help me figure out how to play them or whatever?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone else does.
Does anybody have a sense of...
Okay.
Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara, okay.
Sorry?
Thank you.
Beyond cylinders, does anybody have a sense of this question, which is going to... What are you going to do with your, 20,000 albums or something?
Something like that. I don't know yet, but I think when I move out of my house into the nursing home, which is where I think I'm going to end up after the house is sold, I'll probably sell them off to people that would love them and live off of them. I mean, I'm not going to keep the whole thing together in that sense. I think I will eventually sell them off. I know people will want the records. I know they'll treasure them. That's what I care about, that they will live on, because the whole idea that records wear out is almost, if you play them right, it's not true. I mean, I'll put on a 40-year-old record that I played hundreds of times against the latest CD version of the record. It just kills it. It's not even a comparison. So the records will live on, and people will appreciate them, and I'd rather have them going to individuals who want them. So.
And are you going to start acquiring?
I'm afraid that I have. It was a big, this book is certainly very much a personal journey for me too. And yeah, absolutely. I do collect 78s, I collect LPs. The question, listening to Michael talk, that's interesting to me is what gets lost when the collection is deserialized, right? When the collection is sort of broken up piecemeal and sold off, which tends to happen when collectors die. One of the things I learned when researching my book was that Harry Smith, who's arguably one of the most famous 78 collectors, in America who curated and compiled and produced the Anthology of American Folk Music for Folkways, arguably a document that sort of wrote that story in many ways. I mean, his collection has been deserialized. It's, the Smithsonian has some of it, the New York Public Library has some of it. Some pieces have fallen into private holdings. I mean, in that question of the sort of bigger narrative that Smith was writing, which was maybe a narrative of his taste, but arguably also even a bigger and more interesting narrative, that gets lost when the collection gets split up and sort of transferred all over the place. I mean that's the thing that's sad to me as a fan of collectors and as someone who believes that record collectors are sort of under-heralded figures in the history of American music. When do we kind of start to consider the worth of the collection as a whole and not just the individual pieces?
I'm okay with breaking it up if it's done correctly. I mean, I know if I find a Kinks collector, they can have all my original Pi records, I'd sell them to one person. I'd do it that way. I don't see it as a museum thing, personally.
Sam, where are those 45 hours? Or?
The original, so when we started that project, we had to create new reels. There were 7-inch reels originally, and the standards were that the preservation result was to be a new reel. And then over time, it became digital. The original reels are still out at the University of Arizona. They're in the photography archive.
So they're protected?
Yeah, they're protected and they're in climate control. The original reels are in refrigeration. They'll be fine.
And the Lomax collection, is there an issue of...
Digital, yeah.
It's all digital now.
Yeah, and I have no problem saying that I think we're all really pleased that obviously high-resolution digital audio is now a reality. I mean, I've been with the Lomax Archive for 14 years now, and we started with DAT tape. He started with 2-inch preservation reel. We moved to DAT. For years we used CDs, archival CDs as they were called. And now I'm able to live in Kentucky because all of where I grew up, because all of our holdings are now digital. I can be wherever I like. The Library of Congress over the past 2 years, we've worked with them on cataloging and digitizing Lomax's acetate and aluminum coated glass discs that he recorded with his father in the 30s and 40s. Just recently did a big cataloging project on his 1937 East Kentucky recordings that were recorded to disc. And this is instantaneous disc cutting, so straight into the acetate or aluminum coating. And those were transferred to preservation reel in the 60s to hear the new 24-bit 96K digital audio is exponentially better than hearing the preservation reels. I think that it certainly is the future as far as archival preservation of audio goes.
On that note, I'm going to thank all of you for coming out here and thank all of you for coming.